This is Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight we will be discussing the Globalists' war against faith, farmers, firearms and freedom. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who's been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, the ANC government in South Africa is passing some very momentous pieces of legislation, including the Bella Bill, which threatens private Christian schools and home educators, and proposed amendments to the Private Security Industry Regulations, PSIRA, which threatens the principles of self-defense. What do you think is behind these intrusive legislative bills, and why must we be concerned?
Well, we most certainly should be concerned, because what could be behind it, aside from a totalitarian, socialist, globalist, centralized government agenda, this is in keeping with communism. What has it got to do with the central government, how we run our private Christian schools, our home schools? Without a shadow of a doubt, our private schools are running much better than the government schools, producing much better results, and certainly the home schools too. When I was doing home education for my 4 children, we once had a visit from a government inspector. So the school inspector comes and I said, now, why don't you inspect the government schools? And he says, no, we're not allowed to do that, because we've just seen the responses that 95% of the government schools were inoperable, were not efficient or effective, meaning they either didn't have enough teachers, enough facilities, or didn't have textbooks and things like that. In fact, there were whole provinces of South Africa that didn't receive their school textbooks before the end of the year. So like Limpopo province, the northernmost province of the country, they went through a whole year without the school textbooks arriving. Now, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, because the school textbooks are often quite bad in of themselves. So maybe it wasn't that much of a loss that didn't arrive, but how inefficient is that? So when I asked this inspector why they didn't inspect the government schools, he said, well, we're not allowed to. We're only allowed to inspect private schools and home schools. And then I said, how many government schools would comply with the requirements you have for home schools and private Christian schools? He said, well, virtually none of them. And I mean, we know that that's true. I mean, even Department of Education had to admit that 95% of the schools were dysfunctional, to use their term. And the amount of schools without sufficient teachers, sometimes without principals, without buildings, without desks, children meeting in open air or meeting in classrooms where there's no roof. And there's pictures of kids huddled like 3 to a desk with an umbrella above them because the roof's leaking all over them. And this is in the classroom. And sometimes you've got a school classroom with 20 desks and 80 students. You know, you don't have to be good at maths to know that that's not good. That doesn't work well. But yes, so the hypocrisy of this. Why don't they fix their own government schools? But no, they harass the Christian schools, which are outperforming them on every level. And I had this inspector come into my home, which we happen to have a separate building in our garden for our home school, because I built that home for my mother when she had lost her leg, gangrene and amputation, smoking related. And so my mother moved in, we built this little cottage for her. So when my mother passed away, when she went to heaven, we turned it into our home school. So we actually had a little cottage building where we could walk down the driveway from our home, and our children had a place for their desks, and we had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and there were globes and all kinds of maps on the walls. And this inspector was very impressed, and he said, you know, you've got a better library than most schools. And I know that's true because I've visited many of those government schools to give presentations at. And yet they want to bring in this Bella Bill, which is basically interfering in home education and private schooling. And its agenda is all sorts of things, from gender, transgender ideology, LGBTQ, CRT. It's political. It's got nothing to do with education. This is more to do with indoctrination. So they can't leave well enough alone. The massive growth in homeschooling and private schools in South Africa is a massive vote of no confidence in the government education. Instead of dealing with the government schools, which are an indoctrination gulag at the best of times, they want to harass those that are working. It's like socialism fails. All the government-owned enterprises, state-operated enterprises, they call them, are failures, bankrupt. From South African Airways through the post office, absolute total disaster, catastrophe. You just need to mention Eskom. That's actually a swear word in South Africa. Eskom, because Eskom's the powers of darkness, as they call them, the amount of power failures, scheduled power failures and all that nonsense, and massive overcharging. So if the government wants to do something, why don't they fix their own failures instead of harassing in the free enterprise system? And it was well put by Margaret Thatcher that just as governments need free enterprise and you need a multi-party democracy, people need a choice. He says when people have a choice, they choose to be free. And the Berlin Wall stands as concrete proof of that. I mean, the people were in a socialist utopia and all wanted to flee. And 4.5 million East Germans fled across the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain between 1948 and 1989. So how's that for a vote of no confidence? And it's a concrete proof of the failure of socialism, because as Margaret Thatcher also pointed out, freedom has its problems, but we've never needed to build walls to keep our people in. And so the ANC government's Bella Bill is a threat to freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom for the family, and the family is the basic building block of society. And biblically, God has entrusted children into the hands of the parents for education. As a parent, I can delegate some of the task of education, but I can never delegate the responsibility. The parents are responsible for the education of the children, and nobody cares about your children more than the parents. To suggest that the government cares more or knows more about your children than the parents do is ridiculous. I mean, the governments can't even do their job. Forget about, like, protecting us from crime. So the idea that you should let the government control education, all they've done is replaced education, teaching children how to think critically, with indoctrination, telling children what to think. You must believe this, that, and the other about critical race theory, about LGBTQ perversion and so on, plus transgenderism ideology. So the Bella Bill is a tremendous infringement on religious freedom and freedom of conscience, and it's going to lead to many people wanting to leave the country. And we're trying to have people stay and invest in this country and make it work, fulfill the Great Commission here. We don't want people fleeing the country. Now, many of my friends, their children are all over the world, overseas, and if they want to see their grandchildren, they've got to go to Australia, Canada, or Britain or something, and that's tragic. Fortunately, all of my children and grandchildren are in Cape Town, living within a few minutes of me. Just 3 years ago, all of my children and grandchildren were living in my home, and that just shows that in our family we have a vision for the future. We believe in the future of the Cape of Good Hope, and we're investing in winning this continent to Christ, which we see as a long-term solution, fulfilling the Great Commission, evangelism, discipleship. But the Bella Bill is make it harder for people. I mean, when I was a homeschooling parent, I wouldn't have wanted to deal with this legislation. This is extremely intrusive. And to have a government that can't run their own government schools, try and tell me how to run the homeschooling of my children in my home or a private Christian school down the road, outrageous. And that's unfortunately going to make some people want to leave, which might be the whole goal. But the next one, the security companies bill, that threatens the very principles of self-defense. This is a violent continent. There's a lot of violence that takes place in Africa. And, you know, one only has to think of the massacres of missionaries and Christians in the Congo in the 1960s and the Mau Mau attacks on farmers in Kenya, 1950s. You don't have to think that far to think of Zimbabwe, the terrorism, the murders, the targeting of missionaries, wiping out of farmers, killing of Christians, herding people into churches, burning them down, mobs, mass attacks, all kinds of terrorism, ambushes and so on. And you don't have to even go across the border. Within South Africa, even since freedom, democracy, rainbow nation, peace and tolerance, reindeers and unicorns and all of that, singing Kumbaya, even since 1994, massive amounts of violence. I mean, something in the region of 85,000 or more white people have been murdered in South Africa since 1994. And then if you're taking just murders across the line with all races, it's over 650,000 murders in the country since 1994. Every year it's an average of 20,000 murdered in this country. Now, interesting, back under Verwoerd's era, back in the 1960s, murders each year was something around an average of 67 a year. From Mandela on, it's been 20,000 a year, sometimes reaching up to 35,000 a year. And that's not even counting the abortions, which are over 80,000 a year as well. So if you put all murders together, including abortion, it's well over 100,000 people are being murdered every single year in this country. This is a very dangerous country. More than 4,000 farmers and their family members have been targeted and murdered, not just murdered, but tortured to death since 1994. Just north of Pretoria, there's a monument called Plaasmoorde, or Farm Murders, with 4,000 crosses on the hillside with the names and dates of these people who've, and if you want to read the book like Kill the Boer by Government Complicity and Farm Murders as a subtitle by Ernst Roots, that'll give you the details, and it's sickening reading, burned to death, hacked to death, shot to death, stabbed to death, 69 stab wounds or things like this, and buried alive and bludgeoned to death and so on. It's just hideous. You can't believe that there's that savagery. So in this situation where you've got so much violence in the country, to try and take away armed response and firearms, and not even firearms, but tasers, tear gas, water can, rubber bullets, plastic bullets, even non-lethal self-defense weapons are to be banned. Any weapon that may harm a civilian. And, right down to sponge grenades. For goodness sakes, what harm can a sponge do? You can't call that in any way, it shoots out a sponge. How on earth can this be something that's even expressly non-lethal weapons? They don't even want tasers. It's shocking. You would have thought that in any country, self-defense is a basic right of self-defense. But in a violent continent like Africa, where we've got Boko Haram and the EFF and creeps like Malema who can fill a stadium with 100,000 zombies, all doing the zombie dance, wearing red T-shirts, communist T-shirts, red berets, singing, kill, 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 shoot to kill, shoot the farmer, kill the Boer, shoot to kill, ba, 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 ba. And they're all zombie dancing there. 100,000 people who vote for the EFF in one stadium. It's like a scene from hell. And I'm sure that's where they get the inspiration from. But how many people are willing to raise children and grandchildren in a place like this? We've got people literally singing about killing you. And where there's a track record of terrible tortures and sadistic malice. And yet you're not even allowed to have a weapon. You can't even have a private security company that's got weapons that can come and defend you. And that's just staggering. So to give you a bit of a feel of how serious this is, this security companies bill, we have 600,000 people employed in private security companies in South Africa. That's far more than all the police, all the army, navy, air force combined in this country. So we've got more private security companies than we have national security. Now that should tell you something too. It's a vote of no confidence in the government. If the government was protecting its citizens adequately through the police and army, as we pay our taxes for, then nobody would be spending extra money to get private security companies. The phenomenal exponential growth of private security companies in South Africa is a vote of no confidence in the government. People don't trust in the police. It's so bad. There are police stations, and I know some police stations, that have private security companies that they subscribe to. So there have been so many attacks on police stations where they've had their weapons stolen that they've got private security companies to come and protect them. But it's more serious than that. We have got government cabinet ministers who've got VIP security from the police who still have a private security company in addition to that. And it includes people like Thabo Mbeki, who tried to get rid of all of our private firearms back in 1999. Now, here they've got high walls, security, electric fences, gated communities, they've got private security guards, and they've got VIP police. And they probably own a few firearms too. And then they want to take it away from us. It's such hypocrisy. So this threatens a lot of people. I've heard people saying, this means war. There's no reason for them to take away our firearms unless they want to kill us and steal our properties. And therefore, there are people saying, when they come for my firearms, that's when the war's going to start. There's a lot of people I know who are saying, if they come for my farm, I'm going to shoot. And this could be the idea that they want to first disarm everyone before they go for their expropriating of farms.
The ANC and EFF are aggressively promoting the expropriation without compensation idea. Why do you believe that is?
Well, it's communism. And, the first thing you can see about any communist government is they always fail. Always. They promise what? Land, homes, bread, peace, farms. They promise all sorts of things, and they never succeed. So after a while, what they've got to do is have a scapegoat. Why have we failed? It's the counter-revolutionaries. It's the bourgeoisie. It's the white farmers in this case. And so they've always got a scapegoat. And so after 30 years of the ANC in power, they have completely failed in every single thing. All they've succeeded in is crime and corruption. Everything else is a failure. They can't protect the country. They can't protect the citizens. They can't maintain infrastructure. They can't maintain the roads, the railways. I mean, you've got literally squatter camps growing up on railway lines. For goodness sakes. I mean, how bad is that? You would have thought a railway line is pretty easy to keep clear, but they can't even keep the railway lines going. They are making such a failure of everything. They inherited the superpower of Africa, the most incredible economy on the planet. I mean, even with the only nuclear power station on the subcontinent, and yet they can't maintain anything. They can't even keep the lights on. Regular power failures are part of the schedule, and not to mention water failures, and they can't even keep the water running and the electricity running. So their schools are a failure. It's a complete and utter catastrophe. And so what do? Scapegoat. It's all the whites' fault. We who've been in power for 30 years, it's the fault of the minority. Now, whites in South Africa are 8% of the population. They've got 141 pieces of racist legislation to discriminate against whites. But it's all our fault that their BBBEE, broad-based black economic empowerment legislation and civil service, is failing. So the very people who've been excluded from governments are the ones to blame for the failure of government. And not only scapegoating, but they've also held some kind of carrot out. If their supporters just keep supporting for them, we're going to let you loot the farms and steal all these beautiful farms and homes and loot those homes of these horrible, evil white racists, these Afrikaners and so on, as they like to define everything, the Boers. And so, which is a term that doesn't just mean the people who call themselves Boers or the actual Afrikaans farmers. By Boers, they normally mean just any white person. They don't mind who it is. And we know that in the name of Kill the Boer, they've hacked to death even white American liberals. You just think of people who've come here and who were here to help the ANC prepare for the elections and legalize abortion, still getting hacked to death by them, saying, but I'm an American, I'm here to help you, I'm a comrade. Didn't matter, they still hacked you to death. And so you've got a lot of these people who don't seem to realize that they are considered a Boer as well. Even if they hate the Boers themselves, the fact is, if you're just white, many of these commies assume, even if you've come here specifically to help the communist cause, you might still end up getting hacked to death by these genocidal lunatics because they can't always tell the difference. And, all you whites look the same and that sort of thing. And so plainly what we're dealing with here is a goal of, like Zimbabwe, the ZANU-PF totally failed, completely failed, and at a certain point they turned all the blame on the white farmers, the scapegoats, and they unleashed their people on the sort of carrot and stick sort of thing. And they've got a scapegoat, and then they say, you can have all of their property. So you can see communists are very good at giving away things that they don't own, giving away someone else's property. And, okay, this led to total famine in Zimbabwe. It led to the destroying of 5,600 privately owned commercial white farms. And now the country no longer was employing all those farm workers, no longer feeding the nation, no longer getting foreign exchange and improving trade and exporting food. Now they had to import food, but they didn't have the money, so they needed free aid, which is, how's that for dignity? You've now got to beg for your food. You're not able to earn it. And so the Zimbabwe so-called land reform was a total and utter catastrophe, but nevertheless, Julius Malemba, who's one of the most aggressive promoters of expropriation without compensation, he says Zimbabwe is our model. We're going to follow the Zimbabwe model. Well, that worked so well. Zimbabwe went into the worst inflation ever seen in the history of the world, even worse than Weimar Germany, even after the Depression. even worse than the Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I've got $100 trillion note here, which couldn't buy a loaf of bread, couldn't buy half a loaf of bread in 2008 when it came out. And that's after they had struck 16 zeros off the currency. A $100 trillion note couldn't buy half a loaf of bread. Now that's how much communism can achieve. Only communism can manage to destroy a country that effectively. So following the Soviet dekulakization, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China example, this land reform of Zimbabwe is now in South Africa called expropriation without compensation. And they want to steal the farms to give their followers something to loot, and don't think they've got any intention of turning a productive white-owned farm into a productive black-owned farm. Every single time in Zimbabwe that they took over a productive commercial farm, they ruined the farm, such as cooking and eating the milk cows. That will destroy a dairy farm pretty quick, because you can't cook and eat the dairy cows, you won't get any more milk. And this is the way they operate. They wrecked, looted, destroyed, sometimes just wiped out the herds for no reason except bloody-mindedness, looted what they could from the homes, went back to their townships. So you took a productive farm that was employing people and feeding the nation and exporting food, and now they turned it into just a ash heap. It's a wreck, and there's nothing in the silo, there's nothing in the barn. Everything is destroyed. The fields are destroyed. The livestock's been wiped out. And then, that's called land reform. And make no mistake, there's no intention of having productive farms just owned by people of a different color. It's a matter of destruction. That's the whole motive. But there is something even behind that, and that is Red China wants the lands for aggressive strip mining of rare earth minerals. And so that's what happened in Zimbabwe. They got rid of the 5,600 commercial farms, but amongst those farms, in the southeastern district, they found the Morang diamond fields. And so under some of the farms that were feeding the people, they found diamonds which went straight to China. There's Antonov 126s landed in Morang and took off and flew direct to China, not stopping in Harare or refueling anywhere, and took those diamonds straight to China. And okay, it didn't help the people of Zimbabwe at all, but it enriched China, and that's all that really matters, apparently. And so I think there's a lot of red Chinese who think under these farms in South Africa that are feeding everyone, there's got to be some minerals that we can use. Okay, the cost that's going to be millions, South Africa's going to starve to death, but what a small price to pay for enriching China and the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that's what's behind it to a large extent.
Can we discern a broader agenda behind these intrusive legislative threats?
Yes, I think globalism. This is, you will own nothing and you will eat bugs and you will be happy, as Klaus Schwab said famously for the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. So this, you could look at it from a World Economic Forum set. This is totalitarianism, this is socialism, this is globalism, this is centralization. You can also look at it in terms of second phase of the revolution. The communists always have the first phase where they get political control. And sometime like 10, 20 years later, in the case of Zimbabwe, they go for second phase of the revolution. Or in the case of China, second phase of the revolution. Even in the Soviet Union, second phase of the revolution. And that's when you go for the farms and you go for everything else, the churches, the media. So you first get political control, then you go for cultural and economic control. And that's known as the second phase of the revolution. And so I think this is it. Even the existence of the Economic Freedom Fighters, or EFF, I call them the Everything for Free Party, they started straight after the ANC adopted the second phase of the revolution, or they then changed the name to second phase of transformation. But the terminology was still revolution, really. And so what we're seeing as second phase of revolution, it also fits into what Revelation 13 warns us about, that the beast will want to establish a one world government with a one world economic system and a one world interfaith religion. So I think that's what we're facing. This is plainly the Bella Bill and the disarming of private security companies and the ability to have self-defense, your right of self-defense being threatened. This is all part of the second phase of the revolution. I would say the disarming of the people and taking over their schools to indoctrinate even the homeschoolers and private schoolers with state indoctrination is linked to the expropriation of compensation. It's one push. It's part of a single agenda: globalization, centralization, totalitarianism. Think Tower of Babel, think the pyramids, and that's the kind of idea, top down. You will own nothing, you will eat insects, and you will be happy. And this is, in other terms, the Great Reset. It's part of the one world, new world order that the scripture warns us about in Revelation 13.
31 years ago, the Rwandan Holocaust erupted. Can we learn any lessons from this tragic event in recent African history?
We certainly can. The genocide in Rwanda was preceded by gun control and gun confiscation, which the United Nations played a key role in. And I think we need to remind our listeners that in 1994, before the Holocaust began on the 6th of April 1994, which is now 31 years ago, there was a systematic attempt to disarm the people. The United Nations peacekeepers came and helped to disarm the population, the very population is about to be targeted for the genocide. And so disarming the population makes it possible, because armed citizens save lives. Disarmed citizens are just helpless victims. And criminals prefer disarmed victims, as you can imagine. You can do surveys in prisons, and it's been done. The thing that criminals fear the most is an armed citizen who can shoot back. And that's far more of a fear than the police. In many cases, they don't fear the police because the police in many cases are too restricted. Sometimes they're corrupt and they've been brought up, but many times they're being restrained, almost handcuffed, by their own superiors, that they're being told not to use force in these cases. And so in many cases, the criminals know we're pretty safe from the state. What we can't predict is an armed citizen that they're targeting. So if you can say criminals prefer disarmed victims, you can also say genocidal maniacs prefer disarmed citizens, because an unarmed person is a helpless victim, and that's what they want. A war is uncertain, and wars you can lose and the other side can shoot at you. But a massacre is so much safer and better for mass murdering thugs, because your victim is disarmed and therefore helpless and more vulnerable. So I think that's what we're talking about.
So are you saying that every genocide has been preceded by gun control and weapons confiscation?
Sadly, yes. Just take all the way back to the Armenian genocide in Turkey, 1915. First, Turkey registered the weapons and they controlled them, then they confiscated them, and immediately after confiscating the weapons, the Armenian Christians, 1.5 million of them, were murdered, massacred. It was hideous. The first genocide of the 20th century, 1915. And gun control preceded the genocide in Turkey. And then you can talk about the Soviet Union, 1917. I've seen the posters, which Russian friends have translated for me. Comrades, hand in your weapons. And that's early 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. Come and hand your weapons in. And shortly after the people had been disarmed, then the genocides began, slaughtering Christians. As Richard Wurmbrand pointed out, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, nobody talks about the 66 million Christians killed by the Bolsheviks in Russia. And they should, but that was preceded by genocide. So the Bolshevik communists first disarmed the people before they wiped them out. 50 million in the concentration camps, 66 million killed in total in the 20th century. Red China, 1949. Before the Great Leap Forward, before the Cultural Revolution, weapons are registered and then they're confiscated. And then came the massacres. Over 69 million Chinese murdered by the Communist Party in Red China. Documented in the Black Book of Communism, documented in Death by Government by Professor Rummel. In fact, even the Guinness Book of Records gives Mao Zedong the greatest mass murder of all time award. I mean, he is the one who murdered the most, but he did it through gun control. Cuba also had gun confiscation, gun control, and then they had the massacres. So much so that more than 1 million Cubans fled across the Caribbean on little floating devices, on rafts and little dinghies, through shark-infested waters to escape from this want island paradise. So again, Cuba's another example. Cambodia, the killing fields of Cambodia, 1/3 the people killed, but first they were disarmed through gun control. And then we can talk about Rwanda, of course. Rwanda was a gun-free zone. Rwanda is a classic example of what happens when you allow the state to disarm you. And so we cannot give in to this demand of the ANC government that they want to disarm the security companies and effectively take away the principle of self-defense. If they want to even take away non-lethal weapons, even tasers and plastic and rubber bullets, for goodness sakes, what do they have in mind when you can't even have non-lethal weapons to protect yourself? They want a defenseless population, and that can't be for good reasons. And so, yes, every genocide has been preceded by gun control and weapons confiscation because tyrants prefer helpless victims.
So can you just elaborate on what you think the motive is behind the disarming of the private security companies in South Africa?
Genocide. Kill the Boer, kill the farmer. I can think of no possible logical reason behind aiming to disarm the private security companies in South Africa, which is a major reason why many people are here and invest in this country, is because they've got private security companies. Obviously, they've got no faith in the South African police service, which is as corrupt as hell and inefficient. If they were just corrupt, you might have some hope, but they're inefficient and corrupt. And so I would say the goal can only be genocide, a la Rwanda. In fact, I know that that's true because I was at a political meeting at the Kelvin Grove Club down the road in Rondebosch not that long ago. There was an election time, and the ANC representative was speaking to us, and he at one point said that, you know, when Mandela dies, we will kill you whites like flies. And I said, like in Rwanda? And he said, yes, exactly like Rwanda. And, I mean, this is a member of parliament wanting our vote, and he's speaking to a mostly white audience in this particular event. And he literally said he just couldn't, he was beaming, he was enjoying saying it. We're going to kill you whites like flies. Like Rwanda? Yes, exactly like Rwanda. And then I asked him, did you see how that turned out? I said the genocidal Hutu mass murderers had to flee the country behind the French Operation Turquoise paratroopers screen into Zaire, what was then Zaire, what's now the Congo. And the Tutsi minority, the Tutsi tribe that was being targeted for genocide, are now the governments of the country. You failed in Rwanda. And I said, the Boers in South Africa are not inexperienced at war like the Tutsi were. The Tutsi rose from a people without a great heritage of war and managed to beat these mass murderers because the Hutu mass murderers of the MRND government were cowards. When they faced resistance, they fled. But I said, in South Africa, you've got the Boers who have got a phenomenal military history going back for centuries, who are good riders, good shots, who know the terrain, and who were able to defeat the Soviets and the Cubans, best mechanized divisions in Angola. We've got 650,000, at that time we had 650,000 white South African veterans who had served in the South African Defence Force, who had fought a real war and won it. And I said, what do you think is going to happen when you try to kill them and their relatives? And then there's a lot of South Africans overseas, defence contractors, effectively mercenaries working for the British and American governments and so on, everywhere from Afghanistan to Yemen. And many of them will come back when their families are being threatened here. And they'll probably bring friends as well. Do you really want to go this way? And the man got quite thoughtful, but to think that people out there saying, we need to do in South Africa what was done in Rwanda. We need to kill all the whites. And some have been even more specific, saying, we need to return Africa for the Africans and get rid of all those who are not Africans. And somebody even said, are you talking about the coloureds and Indians? I said, yes, them too, they don't belong here. Now there are millions of coloured people, Afrikaans-speaking coloured people, and there are many Indian people here as well, meaning from India. And they are also being targeted for destruction. So according to some of these radicals in the Everything for Free party, we've got to kill all the non-Africans. And by that, they don't recognize that an Afrikaner is a white African. They don't recognize the colored people. They're not, as the coloreds have said to me, under apartheid we weren't light enough. Under the ANC we're not dark enough. And so they get it in the neck, and they've had enough. So yes, you've got people wanting to wipe out the Indians, wipe out the coloureds in this country. In other words, all the minorities. And I would imagine the Khoisan will be in the same danger, because the Khoisan were exterminated everywhere they'd lived throughout the whole of Africa. And you can see their rock paintings and caves all the way up in Kenya through Tanzania. And the only place where the Khoisan exist now is where they were under the protection of the whites, which is in the Western Cape and in Namibia. And everywhere to the west, to the east of that, they got exterminated because they were hunted out like there were animals being hunted by the Bantu people. And I've seen this throughout Africa even, like the pygmies in the Congo. They get hunted by the local tribes like they're just gorillas or chimpanzees and so on. And they're not treated as normal people. Many of them are enslaved, human trafficked, shot, and so on. So the Khoisan and the Bushmen, even the Bushmen in Namibia, were hunted like slaves. And that's why so many of them joined the Southern Defence Force and fought SWAPO with great enthusiasm, because the SWAPO main support base was the Vambos. And they're the people who enslaved us and hunted us and exterminated our relatives. So there are other indigenous people who are going to be targeted too under this radical communist black nationalism, extremism. This kill the Boer, kill the farmer is not just killing white Afrikaans-speaking farmers, it's English-speaking farmers. It doesn't matter where you come from. You could be from any particular ethnic group, but if you're not a Communist Party member, you'll be targeted. And so this is second phase of the revolution. This is genocide. That's basically what you're talking about.
On many levels, the ANC government in South Africa seems to be failing, as you mentioned. Corruption and crime is out of control. Infrastructure and services are crumbling. International relations seem to have deteriorated, especially with the United States of America. Who is to blame for this lamentable deterioration?
Well, definitely the ANC. African National Congress. When I write ANC, I put a small c, capital ANC, and a small ER. And many people in social media have been picking up on this trait I've been doing for over 10 years of the cancer government, because they are a cancer. Like a cancer, they're a cell that doesn't contribute to the health of the body. They just break down the health of all. Well, in the United States of America, they have got right now a bill being brought before Congress, a bill, the United States-South African Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025. And here they have listed a whole lot of hideous things that the South African government is responsible for. And for example, amongst them includes this lady Pandor, she was the Foreign Affairs Minister, for want of a better word, under the ANC. Back in October the 7th, 2023, she sent a letter of congratulations to the Hamas terrorist group for the massacring and kidnapping of so many Israeli and a few American citizens too, by the way. This has not endeared themselves to the American government, and they are seeing all kinds of legislation being brought together on them, and this includes because they are singing kill the Boer, kill the farmer, because poor farmers are being killed and discriminated against, because the racial legislations that discriminates against whites, because of the hostility to the American government. Just take, for example, in breach of the American sanctions, the Lady R vessel docked in our Simonstown harbour at night and loaded up or offloaded, we're not too sure which, but plainly there was an involvement in breaching sanctions and giving aid to Russia, which is at war with Ukraine, which is, as we know, is a government-sponsored operation. So you've got a American proxy waging a war with Russia through Ukraine, just like Russia once worked to Angola and Cuba as a proxy to fight us in South Africa. And so you've got all these engagements where the Southern government is friends with enemies of the United States, like Iran and Red China, and where you can see they're basically seeking to aggravate the life out of the United States, insulting them and having people like Ibrahim Rasool as American South African ambassador to America, who unnecessarily insulted his host. How diplomatic is that? And to think that the South African government never rebuked him and distanced themselves from his obnoxious remarks. And now they're trying to send someone who had actually sent a congratulatory message to Hamas after the brutal 7th of October attacks in 2023 to America to try and resolve things. which is, can they be that stupid? Are they just being deliberately obnoxious, or are they just absolutely suicidally insane? Because the United States of America has obviously had enough, and they are coming for the ANC. Sanctions are coming, targeted sanctions for ANC leaders, criminal injunctions. They are going to find not just that they're losing out on the hundreds of millions in aid and trade and that the United States invests in this country. It's stupid on many levels, because the United States helped put the ANC in power. Not that I think that was a good idea at all. I think that was extremely treacherous. But a previous American administration, Bill Clinton's by name, went out of their way to betray South Africa and bully South Africa and wage economic warfare against South Africa to get the African National Congress into power in the first place. So you would have thought that the ANC would have at least a bit of gratitude, but they're literally biting the hands that fed them. And right now what you're seeing is with the South African government having taken a massive bribe from Iran to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, in order to take the State of Israel to the International Court of Justice on a genocide charge. Interestingly enough, mentioning Israel on its own as guilty of genocide, not including Hamas. I mean, Hamas did strike first blood. Hamas did attack Israel first, and they didn't just murder a lot of people. They had body cams on themselves, and they broadcast to the world the atrocities they did, including killing babies and so on. So honestly, to take the people who have reacted to terrorism to task for genocide and not say anything about the terrorists who deliberately provoked and inspired this and that they're responding to is just asking for trouble, because anybody should be able to observe that the United States considers the State of Israel as an important ally. And there seems to be a very close relationship between the United States government and the State of Israel, no matter who's in the White House. And on this occasion, all South Africa is doing is aggravating the United States. What did they think would happen? So for them to blame Solidarity or AfriForum or Aranya for this is ridiculous. The Americans have eyes. They're able to read. They can see what's going on. They've got people on the ground here. They've got embassies here. They're able to see, well, this ANC government wanted to change the name of the Santon Drive to Leila Khalid Drive because she is a terrorist who helped hijack an American Transport Airways plane back in 1979, was it? And she also tried to hijack unsuccessfully in LL. And so naming this Santon Drive after Leila Khalid is meant to embarrass America, to rub their noses in it, to force them to have to write the name of this enemy of theirs every time they write the address of the U.S. Embassy. Well, it's not going to work. The Americans said, if you do this, we're going to leave Joburg. We're not going to come back. We're going to leave permanently. You will not have an embassy in Joburg again. We are not going to go along with this. And so it's a stupid game. I mean, for what benefit? Just to make a point, like some little spoiled child wanting to have a temper tantrum. It's not going to help you. You know, if the parents don't want to play your stupid game, you're not going to get the sweeties you wanted or whatever. And you can lie on the floor and scream and throw a temper tantrum as much as you like. It's not going to help you. So the ANC's got to recognize they and they alone are to blame for this lamentable deterioration in relations between the most powerful economy and military on the world and South Africa, who should want to be a good friend and economic partner at the very least. But all this is doing is going to aggravate our economic situation, lead to a weakening of our economy, weakening of the rand. This is not going to help us. It's not going to harm America, but it is going to most certainly lead to some serious consequences for the ANC. The ANC leaders themselves are going to find themselves indicted. They're going to find themselves sanctioned, banned from many places, not able to travel. Not just the aid they're not going to get. They're going to get some punitive, negative sanctions. The United States has got them in their crosshairs, and they're coming for them. I think there's going to be some very serious consequences. And they'll doubtless blame the whites and the Americans and so on for this. They're already blaming AfriForum and Solidarity. And there's no way they've got anything to do with the ANC's policies. Their only contribution is that they've reported accurately on what's going on in the country. And to have the ANC government suddenly act like, what racism? There's no racism in the country. expropriation with compensation? No, it's expropriation with nil compensation. Oh, what a difference. There's a huge difference between nil and none, right? Without compensation and nil compensation. What a difference. Excuse us for misunderstanding. I mean, I thought the same thing, but, what do I know about this?
What can we practically do to bring about an acceptable resolution? Can South Africa be saved? What hope can we see in the future, Dr. Hammond?
Well, I don't think South Africa as a whole can be saved, not under this particular government. The South African government under the ANC seems to be like the Titanic, with one important exception. When the Titanic went down, all the lights were on. And the ANC has crashed into an iceberg of reality. Their ship is going down, and I don't think the country as a whole can be saved because of the demographics and because the ANC have flooded the country. We've got open borders as well. Just like the United States was invaded by millions of illegal aliens, including criminals, we've been invaded as well, and we've got a huge amount of Nigerian drug dealers and others here. And there's a lot of crime going on in the country, and some of it's done by these illegal immigrants that have swamped the country. But the demographics are such that I don't think the bulk of South Africa can be saved as long as the population keeps voting for the same incompetent, corrupt criminals who have looted them and are failing on every level to provide the services. But I do see hope in the future, and that is decentralization. Now, in Rwanda, the Rwandan David, the little minority tribe of the Tutsi, did beat the Hutu Goliath, the mass murderers, and today Rwanda is one of the best-run countries in Africa, one of the most efficient, one of the most friendly to business, one of the easiest countries in Africa to open up business with. As they said, we don't want any aid, we just want trade, just fair trade. And when America came out with we're dropping all of our USAID, the Rwandese president said that is good. Africa needs to learn to care for itself. We shouldn't be dependent on NGOs and foreign aid. And why should the Americans want to fund us? He said, we're not their citizens. We're not their taxpayers. We should be doing our own work, and we should be providing for our own people and our own needs. And so Rwanda is one of the few countries that said, this is a good thing for Africa. We need to cut this umbilical cord. We don't need free things handed out by America. And so there is hope in that. I believe if we work for decentralization and self-determination, I'm particularly thinking of an independent Cape of Good Hope. I think that's some hope for the future. And if the Cape of Good Hope can secede from the chaotic shambles of the ANC-run, cancer-run South Africa, then I think the Kingdom of KwaZulu will probably follow shortly thereafter. And then there'll probably be other parts, Venda, Kwakwa, the Sotho people and so on, the Ndebele's. You could see quite a lot of decentralization quickly, and later on, our different sovereign independent parts of the country could rejoin in a confederation, which doesn't have a centralized government, where we each are able to maintain our own areas, but for mutual defense and for economic, like a common market, we could make some arrangement, some kind of confederation arrangement like in Switzerland. So I do think practically we can work like Nehemiah. Nehemiah saw a shattered, broken down capital, and he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. And then you also think of Queen Esther, who saw there was the plan to wipe out her people, and she went into fasting and prayer. Perhaps she has come to the royal position for such a time as this. And so Esther shows the way of prayer. Nehemiah shows the way of planning and preparation, working with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other, and listening to the voice of the trumpet to see where to rally for mutual defense against threats on the wall. So I think Nehemiah and Esther show us some practical biblical solutions to our contemporary problems. And if you want peace, you must prepare for war. An armed society is a polite society. Armed citizens save lives. And so 2 Chronicles 7:14 shows us the way for the future. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. I would recommend listeners contact www.frontlinemissionsa.org, frontlinemissionsa.org. On the website, you'll see a lot of good audiovisual resources and books, including Frontline Behind Enemy Lines for Christ, where I give basically a history of Africa from a very politically incorrect perspective, how we've been able to evangelize in war zones, even when our enemies to Christ, evangelizing terrorists, transforming terrorists into evangelists. We've got books like Biblical Principles for Africa, Sketches from South African History, A Case for Secession, Holocaust Rwanda, In the Killing Fields of Mozambique. These are just some of our books available that can help listeners learn more about some biblical, practical solutions to our contemporary problems.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hammond. In closing, I'd like to read from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15 to 17. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.